Barron Trump offers his jacket to a freezing veteran. Donald Trump's remark leaves the crowd speechless. The cold wind cut through the air, sending shivers through the crowd gathered in front of the grand podium. People huddled together in thick coats and scarves, their faces red from the chill as they listened to Donald Trump deliver a speech. His voice echoed through the square, confident and commanding, as cameras clicked and recorded every word. It was a high-profile event, the kind that drew both admirers and critics in equal measure. Barron Trump stood quietly at his father's side, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his expensive jacket. At just 17, he was tall and composed, with an air of maturity that set him apart from most kids his age. He had grown used to standing in his father's shadow, observing rather than speaking, blending into the background as the world scrutinized every move his family made. But today, something caught his attention. A man standing off to the side of the crowd, barely noticeable among the sea of faces. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a weathered face that told a story of hardship. His thin frame was draped in a tattered coat, its fabric frayed and patched in places. His hands, red and cracked from the cold, clutched a small sign that read, "Veteran. Hungry. Please help." Barron's eyes lingered on the man, who stood shivering as the wind whipped through the square. His lips were slightly blue, and he seemed to shrink into himself, as though trying to become invisible. The sight made Barron's chest tighten. He glanced at his father, who continued speaking with the same unwavering confidence, unaware of the man's presence. Barron shifted uncomfortably, his fingers fidgeting in his pockets. He knew the protocol: stand still, remain composed, and don't draw attention. But something about the man's hollow gaze gnawed at him, a quiet voice in the back of his mind urging him to do something. He glanced down at his own jacket, its thick material shielding him from the biting cold. His father had bought it for him just last week, a luxury item that most people could only dream of owning. He didn't need it. Not really. Not like the man did. Barron hesitated, his heart pounding as he weighed his options. He could ignore it, pretend he hadn't seen the man and continue standing there like nothing was wrong. Or he could act, do something even if it meant stepping out of line. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the air as Donald finished one part of his speech and paused to let the applause wash over him. Barron took a deep breath, his decision made. He stepped away from his father's side, his movements quiet but deliberate, and began weaving through the crowd. The veteran looked up as Barron approached, his eyes narrowing slightly in confusion. He seemed unsure whether the boy was coming toward him or someone else. When Barron stopped in front of him, the man's expression shifted to one of cautious curiosity. "Hi," Barron said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "Are you okay?" The man blinked, his weathered face softening. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice trembled from the cold. "Don't worry about me, son." Barron shook his head, pulling his jacket off and holding it out to the man. "Here," he said simply. "You need this more than I do." The veteran stared at the jacket, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the gesture. I can't take that," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "That's yours." "It's okay," Barron insisted, stepping closer. "Really? I'll be fine." The man hesitated, his hands hovering over the jacket as though it might disappear if he touched it. Finally, he reached out, his fingers brushing against the fabric. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, son. God bless you." Barron smiled faintly, his cheeks red from the cold. "Take care of yourself," he said before turning to head back to his father's side. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, whispers spreading like wildfire as people realized what had just happened. Phones were raised, cameras clicking as the moment was captured from every angle. When Barron returned to the stage, Donald Trump had noticed the commotion. He paused mid-sentence, his sharp eyes narrowing as he turned to his son. Barron felt his pulse quicken, unsure how his father would react. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and for a moment, the air was thick with anticipation. Donald stepped away from the microphone, his towering figure casting a shadow over Barron. He glanced down at his son, then out at the crowd, his expression unreadable. The veteran stood off to the side, now wrapped in Barron's jacket, his hands clasped together in gratitude. The silence was deafening as Donald turned back to the microphone. He cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured. "I'd like to take a moment to address what just happened." The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on the former president as he continued. "My son, Barron, just reminded us of something very important. In a world where power and privilege often blind us, it's the simple acts of kindness that truly matter." Barron's breath caught in his throat as his father spoke, his words resonating with a sincerity that was rare for the man known for his tough demeanor. "This veteran," Donald continued, gesturing toward the man, "has served our country with honor. He has faced struggles most of us could never imagine. And yet it was my son, a boy of just 17, who saw his pain and decided to help." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. The veteran stood a little taller, his face glowing with a mix of gratitude and pride. Barron felt his cheeks flush, both from embarrassment and a sense of quiet satisfaction. Donald turned to Barron, his stern expression softening. "You did good, son," he said, his voice low but firm. "You did real good." Barron nodded at his father's words, his lips forming a small, shy smile. The weight of the moment hadn't quite sunk in yet, but the crowd's reaction, a mix of cheers, applause, and murmured approval, washed over him. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not like this. For a fleeting second, he glanced toward the veteran who now stood a little taller, wrapped in the warm jacket. The man gave him a small salute, his weathered face crinkling with gratitude. Donald Trump turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying the confident, authoritative tone he was known for. "This moment isn't just about my son's actions," he said, gesturing toward Barron. "It's a reminder of what it means to truly look out for one another. We live in a country where no one should be forgotten, especially those who have served us so selflessly." The applause grew louder, and Barron felt the warmth of pride creeping into his chest. He didn't expect his father to acknowledge the gesture so publicly, let alone use it as a platform to speak about compassion. It felt surreal, but in a good way. As Donald continued to address the crowd, Barron noticed reporters and photographers edging closer, their cameras trained on him and the veteran. He could already imagine the headlines. "Barron Trump's quiet gesture of kindness steals the show." The thought made his stomach twist. He hadn't done it for attention or recognition. He had just wanted to help. The ceremony concluded shortly after, with Donald shaking hands and mingling with key figures while the crowd slowly began to disperse. Barron stayed close to his father, the veteran's face lingering in his mind even as a wave of unfamiliar faces surrounded him. "Barron," Donald said as they walked toward the waiting car. "Stay with me for a moment." Barron nodded, falling in step beside his father. Donald glanced down at him, his expression softening. "You did something today that people won't forget," he said. "But I need you to understand why it matters." Barron looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Why?" he asked. Donald stopped walking, turning to face his son fully. "Because people like him," he said, gesturing toward the veteran, "have been through hell and back for this country. And too often, they're left behind. What you did, it's more than just giving him a jacket. It's showing him and everyone else that he matters. That someone cares." Barron nodded slowly, his father's words sinking in. "I just couldn't stand seeing him like that," he admitted. "It didn't feel right." "That's because you've got a good heart," Donald said, placing a hand on Barron's shoulder. "And I'm proud of you for following it." The words hit Barron harder than he expected. His father wasn't one to hand out praise lightly, and hearing those words now felt like a validation he hadn't realized he needed. He gave a small smile, nodding again as they continued walking toward the car. The story exploded in the media the following day. Pictures of Barron handing his jacket to the veteran were plastered across news outlets and social media platforms, sparking a wave of discussion. Some praised the gesture as a sign of hope and humanity, while others criticized it as a staged political move. Barron tried to tune out the noise, focusing instead on the memory of the veteran's face, the genuine gratitude in his eyes, and reminding himself why he had done it. At breakfast, Donald sat across from Barron, sipping his coffee as he scrolled through his phone. "You're trending," he said casually, showing Barron a headline that read, "Barron Trump's heartwarming gesture goes viral." Barron cringed. "I didn't do it for that," he said quickly. Donald chuckled, setting his phone down. "I know you didn't, but that's how the world works. People see something good, and they run with it." Barron poked at his plate of eggs, his appetite suddenly gone. "I just hope it helps him," he said softly. "The veteran, I mean. Do you think he's okay?" Donald leaned back in his chair, studying his son thoughtfully. "Why don't we find out?" he said. Barron's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean we can look into it," Donald said. "Find out who he is and see what we can do to help. If you're serious about making a difference, let's do it right." Barron hesitated for a moment before nodding. He said, "I want to help." By the afternoon, Donald had pulled a few strings to track down the veteran, whose name was Michael Harris. He was a former Marine who had served in multiple combat zones before returning home and struggling to adjust to civilian life. Health issues and financial troubles had left him homeless, drifting from shelter to shelter while trying to get back on his feet. Donald arranged a meeting, and by evening, Barron found himself sitting across from Michael in a quiet office space. Michael looked different without the crowd and cameras around, still worn and weathered, but more at ease. He smiled faintly when he saw Barron, his eyes warm with gratitude. "Good to see you again, son," Michael said, his voice steady but kind. "And thank you. That jacket, it meant more than you know." Barron felt his cheeks flush. "I'm glad it helped," he said softly. Donald sat beside Barron, his presence commanding but not overbearing. "Michael," he began, "I want you to know that what happened yesterday wasn't just a moment for the cameras. My son genuinely wanted to help, and we're here to see how we can do more." Michael's smile faltered slightly, and he shifted in his seat. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice careful. "But I'm not looking for charity." "This isn't charity," Donald said firmly. "It's respect. For your service and for everything you've given to this country. We owe you that much." Michael hesitated, his eyes flicking between Donald and Barron. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Thank you." The conversation continued, with Donald asking about Michael's needs and how they could help. They discussed housing options, medical care, and potential job opportunities, with Barron listening intently to every word. He couldn't help but feel a growing admiration for Michael, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself despite everything he had been through. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Donald pulled strings to secure temporary housing for Michael while connecting him with resources to address his medical and financial challenges. Barron accompanied his father to several meetings, sitting quietly but observing everything. He wanted to learn about Michael, about the system that had failed him, and about what it truly meant to make a difference. The media frenzy around the story didn't die down, but Barron paid it little mind. For him, the real reward was seeing Michael begin to rebuild his life. Each time they met, Michael seemed a little stronger, a little more hopeful. And each time, Barron felt a deep sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. One day, as they sat in a quiet cafe, Michael turned to Barron with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "it wasn't just the jacket that helped me that day. It was the fact that you saw me, that you cared enough to do something. That's what gave me hope." Barron didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Michael smiled, patting him on the shoulder. "Never lose that, kid. The world needs more people like you." The following weeks solidified a bond between Barron and Michael that neither of them had anticipated. Despite their vastly different worlds, they shared a quiet understanding, one built on respect and empathy. Barron found himself looking forward to their meetings, eager to hear Michael's stories about his time in the military and the challenges he'd faced since returning home. One afternoon, as they sat together in the community center that had become their usual meeting place, Michael shared a story that stuck with Barron. "There was this one mission," Michael began, leaning back in his chair, his eyes distant. "We were in this tiny village overseas, doing what we could to help the locals. Food, water, whatever we had. I remember this little boy, he couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, came up to me and handed me a flower. Just a small thing, barely holding together. But he gave it to me like it was the most precious thing in the world." Barron listened intently, his hands folded in his lap. That boy didn't have much, Michael continued. But he gave me what he could. And I've never forgotten that. It's funny, isn't it? Sometimes the smallest gestures stay with you the longest. Barron nodded slowly, his chest tightening. That's kind of how I felt when I gave you the jacket, he admitted. I didn't think it was a big deal. But seeing how much it meant to you, I don't think I'll ever forget it. Michael smiled, a faint twinkle in his eyes. That's because you have a good heart, kid. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Meanwhile, the media continued to buzz with the story. News outlets debated the implications of Barron's gesture, with some calling it a sign of hope and others questioning its authenticity. But amidst the noise, one thing remained clear. The story had struck a chord with people. Donations to veterans organizations surged, and stories of small acts of kindness began to flood social media, each one inspired by the viral moment. Donald, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. But instead of using it for his own gain, he surprised everyone, including Barron, by focusing on the issue at hand, the struggles faced by veterans. He began attending more events and fundraisers, often bringing Barron along, and spoke candidly about the need for better support systems. At one such event, Donald stood on stage, Barron by his side, addressing a crowd of veterans and their families. My son's gesture wasn't about politics, Donald said, his voice steady. It was about humanity, about recognizing the sacrifices made by those who have served and ensuring they are never forgotten. And if a 17-year-old boy can see that, then there's no excuse for the rest of us. The applause was thunderous, and Barron felt his cheeks flush. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this, but he couldn't deny the pride he felt. His small act had sparked something bigger, something meaningful. One evening, as they sat at home, Donald surprised Barron with an idea. Michael told me about that village boy, Donald said, leaning forward in his chair. The one who gave him the flower. It got me thinking, what if we started something? A program, maybe? Something that encourages small acts of kindness and connects people who need help with those who can give it. Barron's eyes widened. You mean, like, a charity? Something like that, Donald said, nodding. But it wouldn't just be about money. It would be about people helping people in whatever way they can. A jacket, a meal, a kind word, whatever it takes to make a difference. Barron's mind raced, the possibilities unfolding before him. That sounds amazing, he said. Can I help? Donald smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The project, dubbed Operation Small Gestures, quickly gained traction. With Donald's resources and Barron's newfound passion, they launched a campaign that encouraged people to share their stories of kindness and get involved in their communities. Michael became one of the program's ambassadors, sharing his journey and inspiring others to step up. Barron threw himself into the project, spending hours brainstorming ideas and attending meetings. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that truly mattered. At one of the program's events, Michael pulled Barron aside, his expression serious. You've done something incredible here, kid, Michael said. But I want you to promise me something. What's that? Barron asked. Don't lose sight of why you started this, Michael said. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget about the little things. But it's those little things that make all the difference. Barron nodded, his chest tightening. I promise. As the months passed, Operation Small Gestures continued to grow, touching lives across the country. Barron's story remained at its heart, a reminder of the power of one simple act. But for Barron, the real reward wasn't the recognition or the success of the program. It was the relationships he had built along the way. Michael, now living in stable housing and working part-time at the community center, had become a mentor and friend. Donald, too, had surprised Barron with his genuine commitment to the cause, their bond growing stronger with each shared effort. One evening, as Barron sat on the couch with Michael, flipping through photos from recent events, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Thank you, Barron said suddenly, his voice quiet. Michael looked up, surprised. For what? For everything, Barron said. For trusting me. For believing in me. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Michael smiled, his eyes soft. You've got it backward, kid. You're the one who made this happen. I just gave you a little push. Barron shook his head. a small smile tugging at his lips. Maybe, but I think we make a pretty good team. Michael chuckled, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. That we do, Barron. That we do. The impact of Operation Small Gestures grew larger than anyone had anticipated. Stories poured in from all over the country, tales of people stepping up to help their neighbors, strangers, and veterans in need. From kids donating their allowances to buy meals for the homeless, to community members organizing clothing drives, the ripple effect of Barron's small act of kindness had transformed into a movement. For Barron, the experience was life-changing. He was no longer just a teenager standing in his father's shadow. He had found a sense of purpose, a direction for his life that felt meaningful. But the work wasn't without its challenges. Balancing school, public appearances, and the program's growing responsibilities often left him exhausted. Yet every time he heard another story of someone helped by the initiative, he felt renewed energy. One afternoon, Barron sat at the kitchen table, going through a stack of letters that had been sent to Operation Small Gestures. Many of them were thank you notes, filled with heartfelt words from people whose lives had been touched by the program. This one's amazing, Barron said, holding up a letter. It's from a family in Texas. The dad's a veteran, and they were about to lose their home. But the local community stepped in after seeing our campaign and raised enough money to keep them from being evicted. Michael, who was sitting across from him with a cup of coffee, nodded with a proud smile. That's what it's all about, kid. Reminding people that they're not alone. Barron set the letter down, his gaze distant. Do you think we're making a real difference? Like, lasting change? Michael leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the table. Listen, Barron. You're never going to solve all the world's problems. But what you're doing is planting seeds. And those seeds grow into something bigger. You might not see all of it, but trust me, it matters. Barron nodded, his chest swelling with determination. I just wish we could do more. You're already doing more than most people your age, or any age, Michael said. Don't sell yourself short. That evening, Barron and Donald attended a special event hosted by Operation Small Gestures. It was a gala meant to celebrate the program's success and to honor those who had gone above and beyond in their acts of kindness. The room was filled with supporters, veterans, and community leaders, all dressed in their best as they mingled and shared stories. Barron felt a little out of place in his suit, but he stood tall beside his father as they made their way through the crowd. Every few steps, someone stopped to thank him or share how the program had impacted their lives. It was overwhelming, but also deeply humbling. As the evening progressed, Donald took the stage to deliver a speech. His presence commanded the room, and the applause quieted as he began to speak. Tonight, we're here to celebrate something extraordinary, Donald said, his voice steady. We're here to honor the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the belief that even the smallest gestures can create a ripple effect that changes lives. He paused, glancing at Barron, who was seated in the front row beside Michael. I've had many proud moments in my life, Donald continued, his tone softening. But watching my son take a simple act of compassion and turn it into something that has helped thousands of people, that's a pride I can't put into words. The audience erupted into applause, and Barron felt his face flush. He glanced at Michael, who gave him an encouraging nod. Donald raised a hand to quiet the crowd. But this isn't just about Barron or even this program. It's about all of us. It's about stepping up when we see someone in need, about looking beyond ourselves to make the world a better place. And if a 17-year-old boy can remind us of that, then we all have a responsibility to follow his example. The applause was thunderous, and Barron couldn't help but smile. He still wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention, but knowing that the message was reaching people made it all worth it. Later that night, as the event wound down, Barron found himself standing outside on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The cool night air was refreshing, a welcome break from the crowded room inside. You okay, kid? Michael's voice broke the silence, and Barron turned to see him stepping onto the balcony. Yeah, Barron said, leaning on the railing. Just needed a minute. Michael nodded, joining him. Big night. Must feel good, seeing all those people coming together because of what you started. It does, Barron admitted. But it also feels heavy, you know? Like there's so much more to do. Michael chuckled, his breath visible in the chilly air. That's the thing about doing good. It's never really done. But that's what makes it worth it. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city below filling the quiet. Finally, Michael turned to Barron with a serious expression. "You've got something special, Barron," he said. "A heart for people. Don't lose that. The world needs more of it." Barron looked up at Michael, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I won't," he said softly. "I promise." In the weeks that followed, Barron continued to pour his energy into Operation Small Gestures, balancing it with school and the other demands of his life. The program expanded to include workshops on empathy and community building, with Michael often leading the sessions and sharing his story. One day, Barron received a letter that stood out from the others. It was from the family of the young boy Michael had mentioned, the one who had given him the flower during his military service. They had seen Michael's story in the news and wanted to reach out. Barron read the letter aloud to Michael, who sat beside him at the kitchen table. As he finished, Michael's eyes glistened with emotion. "I never thought I'd hear from them again," Michael said, his voice thick. "That boy, he saved me in ways he'll never know." Barron smiled, folding the letter carefully. "Maybe it's time you told him." Michael nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "Maybe it is." The reunion was arranged quietly, without media or fanfare. Barron and Michael traveled to the small town where the boy, now a grown man with a family of his own, lived. The meeting was emotional, filled with tears, laughter, and stories shared over cups of tea. As they sat together, Michael thanked the man for his kindness all those years ago. "You gave me hope when I needed it most," Michael said. "And that hope carried me through everything that came after." The man smiled, his eyes brimming with tears. "I was just a kid," he said. "But I'm glad it meant something." Barron watched the exchange, his heart full. It was a reminder of the power of small gestures, how one act of kindness could ripple across years, touching lives in ways no one could predict. As Barron and Michael traveled back home, Barron felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed determination. The work they were doing wasn't just about helping people in the moment, it was about building connections, creating a world where everyone felt seen and valued. "You've done something amazing, Barron," Michael said as the plane descended. "And you're just getting started." Barron nodded, a quiet smile on his face. "Thanks, Michael. For everything." Michael patted him on the shoulder. "Anytime, kid. The success of Operation Small Gestures had transformed both Barron's and Michael's lives. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a nationwide movement, inspiring countless others to step forward and make their own contributions to their communities. Yet, for all the positivity the program had brought, Barron couldn't ignore the weight of responsibility that had come with it. One evening, as Barron sat at his desk poring over plans for an upcoming Operation Small Gestures outreach event, Donald entered the room. He leaned against the doorframe, his usually commanding presence softened by a rare moment of fatherly concern. "You've been working nonstop," Donald said, his voice low but firm. "You're 17, Barron. You're supposed to have some fun in between saving the world." Barron looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It doesn't feel like work," he said. "I mean, it's a lot, but it matters." Donald stepped closer, pulling out the chair across from Barron and sitting down. "You've done more in the last few months than some people do in a lifetime," he said. "But you can't pour from an empty cup. If you burn yourself out, you won't be able to help anyone." Barron nodded, though his mind was still racing with ideas for the event. "I just feel like there's so much more to do," he admitted. "Like I'll never be able to do enough." Donald leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "No one can do it all," he said. "But what you've done is enough to spark a change. That's what matters." Barron exhaled, the weight of his father's words settling over him. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. "I'll try to take a break." After the event, Donald chuckled, shaking his head. "Stubborn just like me." The outreach event was one of the largest Operation Small Gestures had ever hosted. Held in a sprawling park, it featured resource booths for veterans, community building workshops, and activities for kids. Volunteers bustled about, distributing food, clothing, and care packages, while others helped attendees connect with job opportunities and housing assistance. Barron arrived early, dressed casually in a t-shirt bearing the program's logo. He worked alongside the volunteers, setting up tables and arranging supplies. Despite his exhaustion, he felt a surge of energy as the first attendees began to trickle in. Michael was stationed at one of the booths, sharing his story with visitors and offering words of encouragement. He caught Barron's eye and gave him a thumbs up, his smile warm and reassuring. Barron smiled back, grateful for the steady presence of his friend and mentor. As the day unfolded, Barron found himself immersed in the stories of those who attended the event. He met a single mother who had been living in her car with her 2 children, a young veteran struggling with PTSD, and an elderly man who had been homeless for over a decade. Each story was a reminder of why he had started this journey and why he couldn't stop now. One moment in particular stayed with him. A young boy, no older than 10, approached Barron with a shy smile. He held out a small envelope, his hands trembling slightly. "This is for you," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron took the envelope, opening it to reveal a crumpled $5 bill and a note written in childish handwriting. "For the people who need it." Barron's chest tightened, and he crouched down to the boy's level. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means so much." The boy nodded, his smile widening. "I just want to help, like you." Barron watched as the boy ran back to his mother, who gave him an encouraging pat on the back. The gesture, though small, reminded Barron of the ripple effect his actions had created and the importance of continuing the work. As the event wound down, Barron sat on a bench, his legs aching but his heart full. Michael joined him, handing him a bottle of water. "You did good today, kid," Michael said, taking a seat beside him. Barron nodded, unscrewing the cap and taking a sip. "It feels good," he admitted. "Seeing people get the help they need." Michael leaned back, his eyes scanning the crowd. "That's the thing about this kind of work," he said. "It's not about fixing everything. It's about showing people they're not alone. That someone cares." Barron looked at Michael, his expression thoughtful. "You think it's enough?" Michael smiled, his face crinkling with warmth. "It's more than enough." Later that night, as Barron lay in bed, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The image of the freezing veteran, shivering at the edge of the crowd, was still vivid in his mind. That moment of hesitation, the decision to act, it had changed everything. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Donald stepped inside, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a quieter, more introspective energy. "Can't sleep?" Donald asked, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Barron shook his head. "Just thinking." Donald nodded, resting his hands on his knees. "You've done something incredible, Barron. And I know I don't say this enough, but I'm proud of you. Not just for what you've done, but for who you are." Barron's throat tightened, and he looked away, blinking back the unexpected sting of tears. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. Donald reached out, placing a hand on Barron's shoulder. "Whatever you decide to do next, I'll be here, supporting you every step of the way." Barron nodded, his chest swelling with gratitude. I just want to keep helping people. However I can." Donald smiled, his expression one of quiet pride. "Then that's exactly what you'll do." As the weeks turned into months, Operation Small Gestures continued to grow, reaching more people and creating a lasting impact. Barron balanced his work with his school and personal life, learning to take breaks when needed and rely on the team he and Donald had built. Michael remained a central figure in the program, his story inspiring others to step forward and share their own experiences. The bond between him and Barron deepened, their friendship built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to making a difference. One day, as Barron stood on stage at an event honoring the program's volunteers, he looked out at the crowd and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as he spoke, his voice steady and confident, he knew that this was only the beginning. "Kindness isn't about grand gestures or changing the world all at once," Barron said, his eyes scanning the audience. "It's about the small things, the moments where we choose to see each other, to care, and to act. That's how we make a difference. One gesture at a time." The applause that followed was deafening, but Barron barely heard it. His mind was already on the next step, the next person he could help, the next ripple he could create. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was this: even the smallest act of kindness could change a life. And sometimes, it could change the world. As Operation Small Gestures continued to expand, Barron found himself drawn to the stories of the people it helped. While the program had grown into a well-oiled machine with teams handling logistics and outreach, Barron made it a point to stay directly involved. He visited shelters, attended events, and spoke with individuals whose lives had been touched by the initiative. One day, while visiting a shelter in New York City, Barron met a young girl named Lily. She couldn't have been older than 8, her thin frame swallowed by an oversized coat. Her bright eyes contrasted starkly with her somber expression. "Hi," Barron said, crouching down to her level. "I'm Barron. What's your name?" "Lily," she said softly, clutching a worn stuffed animal to her chest. "It's nice to meet you, Lily," Barron said. "Is that your favorite stuffed animal?" Lily nodded. "Her name's Daisy. She's all I have left from before." Barron's heart ached at the weight of her words. "What happened before?" he asked gently. Lily hesitated, looking down at Daisy. "We had a house," she said finally. "But then my dad got sick, and we lost it." Barron stayed quiet, giving her space to share at her own pace. "My mom's trying really hard," Lily continued, her voice trembling. "But it's hard to find a place to stay." Barron reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Lily," he said. "But you're really brave. And I promise, we're going to do everything we can to help you and your mom." Lily looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Really? Really?" Barron said firmly. "You're not alone in this." That encounter stayed with Barron long after he left the shelter. He couldn't shake the image of Lily clutching Daisy, her small figure so full of quiet resilience. It reminded him of why he had started Operation Small Gestures in the first place, to reach people like her and make sure they felt seen and supported. When he shared Lily's story with Michael later that evening, Michael nodded knowingly. "There are a lot of Lilies out there," he said. "But the fact that you're doing something about it? That's what matters." Barron leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with ideas. "We need to do more," he said. "Not just for her but for kids like her. What if we created a program specifically for families? Something that helps them get back on their feet?" Michael smiled. "Sounds like you've got a plan, kid." Barron spent the next several weeks working tirelessly to bring his idea to life. With input from Michael, his father, and the Operation Small Gestures team, he launched a new initiative called Family First. The program focused on providing housing, job training, and educational resources for families experiencing homelessness. The first Family First event was held in the same shelter where Barron had met Lily. The turnout was overwhelming, with families lining up to receive assistance and learn about the resources available to them. Barron spotted Lily in the crowd, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hi, Lily," Barron said, kneeling to greet her. "How are you doing?" "Better," she said, her voice stronger than before. "Mom says we might get a new place soon." Barron smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "That's amazing, Lily. I'm so happy for you." As Family First gained momentum, Barron's efforts began to attract attention from unexpected places. Celebrities, politicians, and business leaders reached out, offering their support and resources to help expand the program's reach. Barron found himself navigating a world he had only observed from afar, a world of power and influence where deals were made over dinners and promises were exchanged with handshakes. While he appreciated the support, Barron struggled with the pressure that came with it. He often turned to Michael for guidance, seeking advice on how to stay true to the program's mission amidst the noise. "Don't let them distract you," Michael said during one of their conversations. "It's easy to get caught up in the glitz and forget why you're doing this. But you know what matters. Stick to that." Barron nodded, Michael's words grounding him as they always did. "Thanks," he said. "I needed that." One day, during a meeting with potential donors, Barron encountered resistance from a wealthy businessman who questioned the program's sustainability. "This is all well and good," the man said, leaning back in his chair. "But how do you plan to keep it going long-term?" These feel-good initiatives tend to fizzle out once the spotlight fades. Barron felt a flicker of frustration but kept his tone steady. This isn't just a feel-good initiative, he said. It's a movement, and it's already making a lasting impact. We've helped thousands of families and veterans get back on their feet. This isn't about the spotlight, it's about the people. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. But before he could respond, Michael, who had been sitting quietly beside Barron, spoke up. "I'm one of those people," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "I was living on the streets, feeling invisible until this kid saw me. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he cared. And now, because of him, I have a home, a job, and a second chance. So if you're looking for proof that this works, well, you're looking at it." The room fell silent, the businessman shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Barron glanced at Michael, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Well said," Barron murmured as the meeting concluded, the donors leaving with thoughtful expressions. As Operation Small Gestures and Family First continued to thrive, Barron began to think about the future, not just for the programs, but for himself. The experiences he had gained, the people he had met, and the lessons he had learned had changed him in profound ways. One evening, as he sat with his father in their living room, he broached the topic. "Dad," Barron began, "I've been thinking about what I want to do after high school." Donald looked up from his newspaper, his expression curious. "And I want to keep doing this," Barron said, "helping people. But I think I need to learn more about policy, nonprofits, how to make a bigger impact. I'm thinking about studying social work or public policy in college." Donald nodded thoughtfully, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've got my support, whatever you decide. But Barron, you've already done more at 17 than most people do in a lifetime. Just don't forget to enjoy the journey." Barron smiled, his father's words filling him with confidence. "Thanks, Dad. I won't." In the years that followed, Barron continued to build on the foundation he had created. He pursued his education while staying actively involved in Operation Small Gestures and Family First, expanding their reach and refining their impact. Michael remained by his side as a trusted advisor and friend, their bond unshaken by time. Lily and her mother moved into a new home, thanks to the resources provided by Family First. Barron visited them often, watching as Lily blossomed into a confident, bright young girl who no longer carried the weight of uncertainty on her small shoulders. And Michael? He became a symbol of the movement, his story inspiring countless others to step up and help those in need. But for Barron, Michael was more than a symbol, he was family. On the 5th anniversary of Operation Small Gestures, Barron stood on stage at a celebratory event, addressing a crowd of supporters. "When I gave Michael my jacket 5 years ago, I never imagined it would lead to this," Barron said, his voice steady and clear. "But that moment taught me something important, that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that reach far beyond what we can see. And those ripples? They can change the world." The crowd erupted into applause, but Barron's gaze found Michael in the audience, his weathered face glowing with pride. Barron smiled, knowing that their work was far from over, and that together, they could continue making a difference, one small gesture at a time.